It's our 49th presentation. So, the trusty Studebaker. It was only from around 1895 that Studebaker began experimenting with horseless carriages, what we call automobiles. But even up to 1910, the Studebaker was our country's manufacturer of horse-drawn carriages. This picture of the 1901 Studebaker Phaeton model was taken around 1930. And from around that same era, which would be 1929, here's the Rolls-Royce version of the Phaeton, the all-weather Phaeton known as the Newmarket or Phantom 1. Here's the 2022 model, Rolls-Royce Phantom, 563 horsepower engine. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does it mean to speak of power, horsepower? All right. So on July of 1688, the Academy of Sciences in Paris compared the strength of horses to men. By means of a pulley, it was determined that a horse could lift 75 kilograms 1 meter high in 1 second. To lift that equivalent, so that would be about 165 pounds, a little over 3 feet in 1 second, required the strength of 7 men. So a horse was equivalent to 7 men in strength. So the term horsepower, the measure of performance of vehicle engines, has roots to that proportion, which has been updated to the term kilowatts. So at the heart of that transaction of power is the relationship between two species, that the horse is equal in strength to 7 men. A very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with us for our story today, Equus. The Nourishment Project is about joyous curiosity and being part of something much larger than ourselves. Here are some of the references that inform this presentation. And I must say, normally I don't use memoirs as references, but the first book, West with the Night, is one of my favorite books. It is a memoir. It's brilliantly written. It gives you the idea of someone, among other things, a deep love of horses. It informed how I looked in frameworking this presentation. And if you're a horse lover, and you too, Bobby, if you don't like horses, if you read the second book, it's academic but brilliantly written, it'll make you look at them in a different sort of way. Now, back to our story about horses. In the 1880s, this is the 1880s New York, horse cars were being drawn by 12,000 horses and mules, carrying an average of 160 million passengers annually, both regular passengers and, if you look now, firefighters. Horse-powered transportation in Chicago. Look at that quagmire. I can't imagine where it is, somewhere on State Street, I suppose, or Dearborn. We have double-decker horse tram in London. And if you move on to Paris, here we are in front of the then Notre Dame. And if you move a little further on down the streets, Champs-Élysées, and you can see the Plaza Concorde in the back. Even India, this is the one-horse carriage, Ekka Gari. Ekka means one, which is also called Tonga Gari, which is being shown here. China too, in the 19th century, along with rickshaws, there was horse transportation in that country. In the US, horse energy commanded a unique price. Delivery wagons brought mail, meat, milk, and other supplies to rural households. But in the countryside, horses could dine and lodge at less expense, and so they reigned as the choice of transportation in the rural areas. Whereas in the cities, the trusty steed faced competition and was eventually replaced by cost-effective mechanical rivals, the buses and the trams. Now one can easily guess, in urban areas, stable, food, water for horses came at a higher price than at the countryside. And traffic accidents took on an entirely new meaning when horse was part of your daily transportation. So there was significant economic burden from sanitary issues. Manure worked as fertilizer in the country. However, in the city, the manure and horse urine caused a stench and attracted disease-bearing flies. When it rained, the manure covered the streets and it turned to muck. When dry, the wind whipped up the manure dust and choked the citizenry. I can't imagine going outside at all. There's even a horse manure crisis in 1894. You can look this up. There's newspaper accounts of it. So along with transportation and transporting both goods and food and all of that, horses were also another forced labor of the US economy. They were actually, along with slaves, at the heart of the US economy. So for millennia, even well into the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, this oat-powered engine was universal and nearly irreplaceable. And just look at it. The horse is a beautiful beast. We could just stop the presentation and gape at it, couldn't we? But wait, one really could spend a very pleasant hour dazzled by their visual grace. But here's the main story. The mane, in this case, button braided. Definitely not a ponytail. And incidentally, one does have to be careful when doing the mane for the horses. If it's braided too tightly, it may affect the dressage performance. And that's where the horse shows off how well trained it is. They dance, that's dressage. A French braid, you almost think there's a Rapunzel waiting for her knight. And here is a braid very, very neatly done. Well, most horse breeds with long mane come from the cold region. This one shown here, these come from a region of the Netherlands called Friesland. And the Frisian horses often grace romance novels. You know, those cheesy covers with long-haired, beefy blonde men. They should just take the men out and leave the horses on. And desert horses like this Marwari horse from India, they have much shorter manes, and they also have less mane. And some, like this one shown, has a beautiful blue tinge. Marwari horses are known for their unique ear placements. The tips point inwards and almost touch. Another mesmerizing desert horse, and one of the oldest horse breeds in the world, the Achal Teke. I know there's a K, Americans pronounce it Achal Tepe, but in that area, the K is more guttural, Achal Tepe. They come from Turkmenistan, bordering Iran and Russia. So when Russia occupied Turkmenistan in 1917, they confiscated most of the horses because the horses were used for rebellions. So they took most of the horses. And in the 1960s and 1970s, the Soviet Union slaughtered many of these horses to feed the people. Can you imagine slaughtering this for meat? The Ahal Teke signature is its marvelous metallic glowing coat. The hairs of these beautiful horses are hollow, creating a sort of prism for light to travel through. And just look at this beauty. But aesthetics is not the focus for today's narrative. It's really about the relationship between the two species, Equus ferus and us, Homo sapiens. We've ridden through history on the back of horses. Our culture is just a sample of, Hoyer to hoe from the ring cycle shown here. And conquest, be it the American Civil War or those in Europe, charging cavalry was a common sight of war. US Civil War soldiers and even many French soldiers were recruited from the rural areas. And the psychological effect of watching the mass slaughter of horses, an animal that they grew up with, was significant. Horses sustained us, literally, in some parts of the world. As mentioned just a few slides ago, the Soviet Union butchered horses for meat. The Swedes even now love horse meat. In Sweden, meatballs are often made from horse meat, and South America provides the meat for Sweden. So where exactly does one begin to track the imprint of these beautiful beings on humanity? Well, imagine Marilyn Monroe as the first lady of not John Kennedy, but Richard Nixon. Talk about an interesting pair. And so in this scenario, additionally, imagine that far from being his arm candy, she is the main driver of his ambition and success. With that in mind, step into the scenario that was the 6th century. It was the very unlikely pairing of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I and his beloved Empress Theodora. He, a son of a peasant who eventually becomes ruler, and she, the daughter of a circus trainer, a bear trainer who becomes his empress. It is Justinian I who adorns the walls of the Basilica San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy. Shown here, there he is holding the bread of Christ, his beloved Theodora on the opposite wall with the wine. As a composite, so here are the two mosaics of Justinian and Theodora. I took the wider macro view so I could show you the church. It's magnificent. As a composite, the two of them are the glittering picture of Eucharist. But what of them, Justinian and Theodora, in reality? Justinian had to have the laws changed in order to marry Theodora, because back then you couldn't just willy-nilly marry an actress. Henry VIII had nothing on Justinian I. Though they were childless, there was no question of ever beheading someone like Theodora. History states that they were a very devoted couple. She was daring, and he was intelligent enough to take her counsel. It was truly a match made in heaven. So Ravenna is a bike-friendly old city with marvelous graffiti. And this graffiti captures Theodora's pluck rather beautifully. Theodora, the horse trainer's daughter, grew up to be a performer, an actress. And in those days, actresses were viewed as concubines, akin to the aristocratic harlots, the demimondes that one finds in the 18th and 19th century France and elsewhere. Her acts were salacious, especially one that realistically portrayed the story of Leda and the Swan. It's the one where the swan impregnates a woman. Imagine that. So misogynist historians document Theodora's lament that there were only 3 orifices in the human body for pleasure. Let that sink in. Who would ever give up a woman like that? I'd marry her. She also codified laws to punish pimps, and she promoted education of girls. So effectively, she was rather progressive, and she was a sexy, intelligent beast. So who put this unlikely pair of Justinian and Theodora together? Guess who? Horses. Horse races during antiquity were like Wimbledon, NFL, basketball, cricket, all rolled into one, because this was not seedy off-track betting. The stadiums were where men picked up aristocratic women and vice versa. It was a social sport. Theodora and Justinian were devoted to chariot races and apparently met each other there. In grounds like this, centuries ago, just imagine the thundering of hooves, the roar of the crowds, the frenzy of victory, fortunes lost, lovers found, all on the periphery of the carousel of horses. So in Rome, for example, Circus Maximus, the beating heart of the center of the empire, accommodated 250,000 people for weekly chariot races. The driver's equipment consisted of a leather helmet, shin guards, chest protector, a jersey, a whip, and a curved knife with which it was very handy for cutting opponents who came too close, or to cut themselves loose from entangling reins if you fell off from the chariot. Races started when the emperor dropped his napkin and a hapless referee would try to keep order from horseback. After some 7 savage laps, those who managed not to be upended or killed and finished in the top 3 took home prize money. So the best drivers could become extraordinarily wealthy, earning in the billions by today's standards. I mean, there's documentation. One of them earned almost 15 billion. It's a staggering number. Tiger Woods maybe earns 1 billion or so. So these are very popular things. So now chariot races often turned violent And in one incident in 532 CE being current era, Justinian threatened to punish some charioteers who had created some problems. The public turned on him, ravaged his city, Constantinople, with riots that lasted 5 days. These riots are known in history as the Nika riots, because the public was screaming, Nika, Nika, means victory, victory. That is the term from which we get the term Nike. Justinian had wanted to flee, but Theodora, titanium backboned, apparently stated, do as you please, run if you like, but that for her, royal purple will be the only burial shroud, effectively saying she's not budging. She's a handful, I like her. Justinian stayed and put down the revolt. He rebuilt Constantinople, including the church, which is now a mosque, the Hagia Sophia. That structure has been rebuilt and reformatted many times since. Horse racing brought Justinian and Theodora together and gave them the backdrop to become legend. And empires, not just the one in Byzantine times, have been built on the back of horses. For example, China. Similar to the Silk Route story, there was the horse-tea trade route, known also as the Southern Silk Route, that went from the Sichuan region through Tibet into Eastern India. Imagine traveling down these desolate but utterly beautiful roads. So now tea used to be an invaluable currency. One bartered with it across tribes. And in antiquity, prized horses came from the Fergana region. The red arrow is pointing to the region, which is present-day Uzbekistan. And rulers from the area now known as China paid for these horses with tea. The horses then powered war, fueled the expansion of the Chinese kingdom. The horse from the Fergana Valley was small, strong, handy, and sturdy, and known to the Han Chinese as heavenly horses, for they, and I quote, sweated blood, close quotes. This was seen, this sweating of blood, as a superpower. The Han Emperor Wu believed that if he got these horses, he could beat his rivals. So modern historians believe that the Fergana horses had blood-sucking parasites in their manes. And so when they were galloping, the blood oozing from their bodies mixed with their sweat. This gave the impression that they were sweating blood, which was seen by the Chinese as a divine sign from heaven. And out of these Himalayan steppes, later down in the century, the Mongols rode into history. The Mongols conquered land from the Korean peninsula to the eastern edge of Turkey and had the largest empire per land coverage in history, much bigger than the British Empire in terms of coverage of land, just dwarfed the Roman Empire. So beginning in the 13th century, under Genghis Khan, he's also known as Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan's grandsons Kublai Khan, and Kublai Khan established the One dynasty in China because the land coverage was all of Eurasia. Kublai's brother Hulegu controlled the Ilkhanate dynasty in areas that we now call as Iraq, Iran, all the way to Western Pakistan. So the entire horizontal of Eurasia was under Mongol control. These Mongols were fabled riders, and the swift horses gave them a huge advantage. Speed was their weapon. So these were the times of the Crusades, and the Crusades were wars between Christians and Muslims. When the Mongols came into power, the Fifth Crusade had just ended, and the Arabs had closed the Silk Roads. The traders were not happy. On the right of this picture, the turbaned Muslim is depicted, and the Christian is on the left. Under Mongol rule, the entire region opened up as a unified empire, and this was known as Pax Mongolica, which allowed the Silk Road trades to resume safely throughout the land. It is this Pax Mongolica that allows a Marco Polo to journey across Eurasia. The strength powering the Mongol victories was their fabled riding and archery skills. Creation stories will surprise. Horse and food have surprising connotations beyond Swedish meatballs. Genghis Khan's cavalry needed to eat on the go, And so they would scrape cuts of meat off sheep and form them into patties. These patties were put under their saddles while they rode, and the constant jarring between the seat and the back of the horse, both the sweat from the horse salted and tenderized the meat and was eaten by the soldiers raw. So this is their version of what we call fast food, food on the go. And as the Mongols conquered Russia and beyond, actually, their habits were assimilated. So this entire region was largely unknown to the European geographers. And so I'm going to point, they assigned the name, the blanket term Tartary to that entire region. Russians adopted their invaders' ground meat into their own dish and called it steak tartare. A modern deconstructed version is being shown here. So simply put, steak tartare is a dish of finely chopped beef, served raw, mixed with any number of accompaniments, but mostly the common ones are egg yolk, mustard, sauces, and seasonings. During the 1600s, the shipping trade opened between the Russian ports and the German port of Hamburg. And along with the Russian immigrants, the Russian steak tartare was brought to Germany via this Hamburg port. During the mid-18th century, England experienced a surge of German immigrants, and these Germans brought the steak tartare with them. Eventually, the transatlantic Hamburg-America line brought the steak tartare steak while they were traveling across the Atlantic and served that meat on between two pieces of bread to the emigrants embarking to America. And this idea of steak, beef between two breads, it caught on fire. The sandwich's popularity exploded in the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. And so this Mongol-inspired meat that came from pieces of meat ridden on between the saddle of the horses. So this meat that was concocted 800 years ago has ended up becoming the quintessential American meal, the hamburger. Isn't history surprising? So along with sustenance, horses also inspired food for thought in terms of culture. And in these stories, religion rides along as well. So Caravaggio's The Conversion on the Way to Damascus. So this biblical subject has been done by many painters, including one of my favorites, Bruegel. So Caravaggio paints the biblical Paul, who was on his way to persecute the Christians. So the tone of the bridleless horse with the majestic white coloring, the full-bodied rump, the ermine blanket beneath Paul suggests an official. Now, Paul has fallen off his horse, and in doing so was converted himself. Talk about getting off your high horse. Because what happened is his physical fall elevated Paul spiritually. But what I love is how the groom is more concerned with soothing the horse than to do anything with Paul. And centuries later, this familiar composition of a man who has fallen off his horse is shown here, though the context is of a different devotion, that of gambling. People often forget that the painter Edgar Degas admired the flanks of racehorses almost as much as the slender legs of the ballet dancers. Had he been born 2 centuries earlier, during the times of Louis XIV, the Sun King, Degas would have been able to simultaneously indulge both pleasures, because during the Sun King's period, the dance halls and the indoor riding areas were largely identical. The riding schools taught the exemplary movement of rider and horse, an advanced form of court dance, where the aim was to replicate the elegance and grace of ballet dancers. The ritual of ballet pirouettes, leaps and airs above the ground, and the poised geometry of bodies hovering beyond gravity. Dressage and ballet, isn't it similar? It is, because dressage is effectively ballet by beautiful horses. Degas effectively painted the same thing. Those attempting victory over gravity, falling motion, the impression of levitation. He just painted it in different forms. And the most important dressage step of the levade It's quite an unequal pairing if you really look at it. The horse rests its weight on the hind legs, the rider perpendicular to the ground. The classic pose of sovereignty. And Western artists obsess with this iconography of sovereignty. You will see it over and over and over again. And small wonder, because horse and their ballet grace came into the hands of the military before going to the domain of the racing trainers. Because if you think about it, a kick from those graceful and incredibly powerful legs would kill an opponent. Quite a conquest when you can use horse as a weapon of war. And Pablo Picasso's Guernica captures the devastation and savagery of modern warfare on everyday people, and the Spanish horse is definitely included in the depiction. The carpet bombing of European cities during the Second World War. What happened was that on April 26, 1937, on a Monday, on a market day, the Spanish town of Guernica was bombed by German and Italian because they dropped a 550-pound explosive to crush the building so that the fires would spread quickly. Guernica was a painting, artwork in response to that by Pablo Picasso. The bull and the horse, the bull was the minotaur he had done before, was evident in the early drafts, along with the fallen soldier and the woman with the lamp. She's up here. And she reminds me of Florence Nightingale. The one never quite knows what all the symbolisms are. It's up to the individual viewer. There were revisions of it, but its austere palette of black, white, and gray is said to have been inspired by the grainy quality of newsprint, reflecting that the Spanish Civil War was one of the first conflicts intensively covered by the media. So Picasso was living in Nazi-occupied Paris during World War II. And upon seeing, and the story goes that upon seeing a photo of Guernica in his apartment, one German soldier, an officer, I guess, had allegedly asked him, "Did you do that?" To which Picasso had responded, "No, you did." One can see the horse frenzied in the center. And the terror of that hell has been expressed in art previously in printmaking. So themes repeat. Horses have been involved in this version of representing absolute hell on earth or outside by the German Albrecht Dürer. On the opposite spectrum, heavenly horses, or at least horses taking angels to heaven, here captured in textiles in the copes. One doesn't often see angels riding on horses. But that's why I thought this was very interesting. Usually to me, when I see angels in any form, they usually float dreamily on their own wings, but not in this one. And 15th century Pisanello, the artist, obsessed over horses. I am biased towards line drawings and etchings, and this reflects in my selections. So do forgive me if you like other forms of artwork. Across the ages, many artists have obsessed over horses. Few with the clinical precision of George Stubbs. He's practically the Leonardo da Vinci of the equine kingdom. His engravings lend a statuesque dignity and grandeur as he analyzes his subjects completely scientifically. So let's have a proverbial how the sausage is made moment. Because do realize, Stubbs worked dissecting horses in a lonely Lincolnshire farmhouse in England. Just imagine the stench. To reveal the muscles and arteries intact, Stubbs sometimes bled the horses to death to avoid causing any damage to their bones, tendons, or veins. Autopsy as an art form. And Stubbs sketched without pause. He worked for weeks on the carcasses, and eventually he boiled the skeleton and he charted it also. He isolated the animal body, free of accessory of any window dressing. And Stubbs' pen closely followed the anatomist's knife. That's exactly what he did. His work has photorealistic precision. He did away with everything that was not part of the stallion, the mare, and sometimes the foal. Stubbs' anatomical drawings, though they are static, are rather emotionally moving. And I feel the meditation of a Japanese garden in his work, where there is simply nothing left to take away. Only the essence remains. This idea of kare sansui. Those seemingly different visuals, this artist has a similar intense devotion to drawing and capturing horses. The female French painter Rosa Bonheur underwent difficulties that a male peers simply didn't have to deal with. For example, she had to get a license to be able to wear trousers to enter areas generally forbidden to women, so she dressed as a man. Men's clothing made it easier for her to visit farms, butcher shops, and slaughterhouses. So imagine all these extra steps women and she had to take just to paint what every other man could do anyway. Back then, it was illegal for her women to wear pants, but her devotion paid off handsomely. The public and the press bowed to her artistry. Her work toured Europe, and even Queen Victoria requested a private viewing in Windsor Castle of her famous painting, The Horse Fair. By her own admission, and I'm saying by her own meaning, Rosa Bonheur, her painting evokes the Greek classic of the Parthenon, quiet and sublime. These are compositions of clarity and impetuosity, if you really look at them. Art is acutely aware of its own history and its own self-referencing. So be it the framework similarities between Degas and Caravaggio, the man falling off the horse, or Rosa Bonheur and the Parthenon frise, because look how cleverly she uses light to draw your eyes to the rump of the horses, similar to what Caravaggio did in his Conversion on the Way to Damascus. And to continue our study about the horse's imprint on humanity, we're going to return to times even older than the Greek classics, to the formation of heaven. The constellation of Pegasus is the seventh largest constellation in the sky. And in case you had a hard time imagining it, here is the illusion of the horse. So Pegasus is named after the winged horse from Greek mythology. Pegasus, mythologically, was born when the hero Perseus cut off Medusa's head, who was impregnated by the god Poseidon. Now, speaking of Poseidon, here's one story, and one version of a story as to why he created horses. He had fallen in love with the goddess Demeter, goddess of harvest. She was less than impressed by him and asked him to make the most beautiful animal in the world. And by the time he figured out to create this creature, the horse, he lost interest in Demeter, which was just as well, because Demeter was his sister. History and these stories are funky, to say the least. Almost Wagnerian. They're always sleeping with their aunts and sisters. Greeks and horses. The story of the Trojan horse from the epic Odyssey. Since most of us know it, I'm going to skip it. The Greek legend, Alexander the Great. Medusa appears again in the story of horses, because there she is, I'm going to point, right in the center of the breastplate on his armor. One reason that is there is presumably for protection, because the head of the Medusa had the power to turn people into stones. And that is a handy figurative weapon to have against your enemies. When they look at you, they just drop off. So there is Alexander riding his beloved horse named Bucephalus. In this mosaic, Alexander rides Bucephalus while fighting the Persian king Darius. So in the ancient times, Persia was the golden apple empire everyone wanted to topple. And regarding the horse, the story is that when Alexander was 12 or 13 years old, a horse dealer had brought a new horse to his father, Philip, the ruler of Macedonia. No one else could tame that horse. Alexander was given a chance and surprised all by subduing it. He had spoken soothingly to the horse and turned it towards the sun so that it could no longer see its own shadow, which was the cause of the horse's duress. And Alexander had apparently dropped his cloak as well, and thereby calming the horse, successfully trained the horse. Bucephalus was his, and Alexander rode him into glory and actually all the way to his failed desire to conquer India, which is numismatically being shown here. Bucephalus allegedly died in war in the location of what is now Pakistan, which used to be part of India before British declared otherwise. And so Alexander had conquered that area, and when his horse died, he renamed that area after the horse. The place is now called Jalalpur Sharif. And speaking of glorifying one's beloved horse, the Roman ruler Caligula loved his horse, Incitatus. He invited his horse home for dinner, fed him golden barley, and drank to the horse's health in gold goblets. As a ruler, Caligula promised to appoint his horse as consul. So the consul was the highest government position, but died before actually making it true. The horse didn't die, Caligula died. But the reality is he probably said it to put his consuls in their place, as in, my horse can do your job, so just pipe down and ante up. That's probably what he meant. But the Roman love of horses continue even today. And America isn't far behind with the cowboys, the idea of the cowboys and their beloved Mustangs. And the modern electric version of the Ford Mustang shown here. It's a marriage of the old and the new technology with the classic old shape. Horses made this novel one of the best-selling books of all times. The story is told from the horse's point of view, and television followed suit because it was successful. And TV went right to the source and asked the horse, Mr. Ed. I loved that show. When I came from India, I used to watch old American TV shows to pick up the right accent. So I've watched everything from Mr. Ed to Bewitched, The Golden Girls. I know all the themes and the songs and the plots to these TV series. But my accent from India still apparently remains. But I enjoyed watching the shows. So another little TV show, this one watched by my children when they were younger, My Little Pony. I refuse to sit through these. But I love this little character from the recent Lego movie. This character is called Unikitty, a unicorn cat hybrid. As far as I'm concerned, the unicorn is horse enough. So this character is psychotic, a passive aggressive. It's so funny. She goes, I must be nice before she has a complete meltdown and goes psycho. Funny. I have children, and so you cannot imagine the spectrum that pops up on my radar. Golf shows up too, thanks to my husband. And though more hockey than golf, polo, a game with horses, is a game that originated in India. And horses' imprint on humanities continue. From Persia, which is present-day Iran, the epic Shahnameh, written by the Persian poet Ferdowsi. In that story, the horse named Raksh means luminous, is highly intelligent, and his loyalty is legendary. No one but the hero Rustam ever rides Raksh, and Raksh recognizes no one but Rustam as his master. But what I loved, and the reason I brought this into the story, is the poetic imagery evoked by the poetry of Islam, Persia. The description of Raksh makes one sigh. They describe the color of Raksh as rose leaves that have been scattered upon a saffron ground. Take that in. Imagine the perfume of such a description. Saffron and rose leaves together. You can see her right there, or see him right there. So now, please recall the Marwari horse from India, the blue-tinged one. So, miniature paintings that often seem unreal can be surprisingly grounded in reality. Because unless one knows that blue-tinged horses, though incredibly rare, are possible, one might dismiss the inclusion of this blue horse right there as an artist's flight of fancy, but it wasn't. The painting depicts the historical, it's a true Indian king Maharana Pratap, who used to fight the Mughal emperor Akbar. So Pratap's horse, the blue-tinged one, it was named Chetak, and he too died protecting his king. Moving on, For Lepage, Hermes, all these luxury brands started off serving the world of horses. Hermes made its brand producing quality equipment for coaches and horses, and that is reflected directly on their logo. On their website, The product description waxes poetically, and I'm going to quote, "A subtle alliance of unmatched leather craftsmanship and equestrian science. This tailor-made saddle brings riders and horses together seamlessly and overcomes obstacles in style." Close quotes. Craftsmanship and style. Nonsense. This isn't style. This is, behold, craftsmanship. So before the days of Bentleys and Lamborghinis and Rolls-Royce Phantoms, the status symbol of choice were horse saddles to convey personal wealth, especially in nomadic Tibetan and Mongolian cultures. So now come Hermes, behold what craftsmanship truly is. Saddle face plates made from deeply chiseled iron and gilt, studded with turquoise. Now you imagine that saddle on this Ahal Teke, glistening beauty. But we are not done, because saddles come with a silk cover, the saddle cloth. If it were blue as shown here, it suggests that the owner was a lay nobleman, as opposed to a religious figure who would have had a yellow silk saddle cover. So the gilt technique depicted on the saddle is known in the West as damasking. And this saddle has an unusually thick layer of gold, making this an extremely expensive luxury item. Saddles were a prominent item of use and trade along the Silk Road, those legendary Silk Roads. And on a side note, this is one of the goals of the Nourishment Projects, to comprehend real luxury, true beauty. And material beauty is just one aspect, not to just make one into a luxury goods shopper. That's not the intent, but to become even more discerning so as to not buy glass at the price of diamonds, because nowadays marketing is so awful. Because here's real craftsmanship, not the types that Hermes and their ilks tries to pass off as the epitome of style. No, it is not. This saddle represents tradition, care, meticulous details, years of devotion to craftsmanship, incorporating spirituality. It's priceless. Marvel at the crosshatched scoring of the metal, of the overlaying of gold onto the roughened surface of iron, which is, I'm going to point now, visible here in the dragon heads. You can see them down there, and in the jewels. Such devotion to craftsmanship isn't limited to the East. This handcrafted ivory saddle from Europe, I mean, just look at the work on these. Now imagine this, on this ebony beauty, riding through the plain at night, iridescent in the moonlight. But then one might correctly say, why gild this breathing, living lily? But we do, because horses, this living, breathing, beautiful, proverbial lily, lends status. That is why you have million-dollar horses in private stables, prize-winning stallions who lend their owner the dignity of being a thoroughbred. That is the way it goes. It's not all a pretty message. This monomania of bloodlines that are treasured by stables, this branding of greatness, are kissing cousins of these beliefs of eugenics. Eugenics is all about superior race. Breeding for superior performance in one species informed the racist beliefs in the other. So the father of eugenics, Francis Galton, acknowledged the contribution of English horse breeders to his research. Galton's cousin, Charles Darwin, came from a horse-loving family on his mother's side. His side was also related to the Wedgwood family, the ones who made the pottery. So again, targeted tampering with genetic inheritance, echoes of which lurk now in today's genome editing. The birth of this kind of dream came from the stables of the 18th century. The Nourishment Project does not slide into ugly territory in any position. And so we are going to tread lightly and swiftly over this. The Western race's class undertones gleaned from the idea of the horse thoroughbreds. Those not born in the saddle aching for this chimera of sophistication, find a coalescence of art and aristocratic life in the world of breeding and European racetracks. So things like Epsom, Ascot, Longchamp, all of this. And to really get the point across, we use a historical figure. But the principle applies now, had applied before, and will apply well into the future. So, Paul Mellon, he of the American banking family, invested considerable time and resources to be eventually promoted to the Racing Hall of Fame. So money wasn't his goal. He had loads of that. What horses allowed was an entrance into the luxury branding of an entirely different level, because one aristocratic stable greets another. Owning thoroughbreds bestows a branding like no other. With the exorbitant money involved, the pejorative term horse trader becomes a badge of honor. And in the world of connoisseurship of anything, and especially horses, that world is a continuum, a network of names, provenances, and possessions. And in the land of thoroughbred breeding, England, the registry of noble breeds is more established in reality than human nobility. They have books on this, like a social register of horses, because there are, count 3 founding stallions of English thoroughbreds. All good English breeding traces back to one of those 3 stallions. You will trace it back meticulously. One could marry into royalty, not so with thoroughbreds. Though ironically, some of the English royalty do resemble horses to me. They're a bit long in the tooth. But in these worlds, I mean, come on, you've seen them. Genealogy matters because form and beauty in the world of horses are inherited. And there's tons of money riding in this. So be it in Europe or in the fabled races in once British-ruled Hong Kong, which is the Happy Valley racetrack. Can you imagine this opened 4 years right after British troops landed in Hong Kong in the mid-19th century? British love racetracks because racing is a decidedly British preoccupation. Doesn't it make you wonder, how is Chinese control of Hong Kong going to affect this prestigious environment? Money will pour in like nobody's business. Again, history keeps repeating. That which drew Emperor Justinian and Empress Theodora, horses, draws today's royalty across the globe. Queen Elizabeth II knows horses and truly loves them. And here, one horse connoisseur greets another, a network of names and access. On the right is His Highness Aga Khan, head of the Ismaili religion. Aga Khan has won many of the most prestigious thoroughbred races in Europe, including the France's Grand Prix. It is he, Aga Khan, who came to the rescue and preservation of the 15th century Chantilly estates in France, heart of French culture. Preserving the racetrack is what drew him initially. And both he and his brother were recognized by the French ministry for their contribution. So again, Chantilly is at the heart of French culture. So when right-wing French xenophobes squeal about cultural purity, I wonder if they know who is underwriting all that arrogance. It was horse that drew Aga Khan to first preserve Chantilly. And the British passion for race horses is true when they colonized India as well. Here are the racetracks in Calcutta, my birthplace. That racecourse in Calcutta, now known as Kolkata, the road curving past Victoria Memorial, all these are part of my childhood. Like these children pictured here, I too, as a child, had spent Sundays riding quarter horses by the racetrack. These were the horses that did not make the cut and were available for rent. I remember those moments on a horse fondly because it was the only time I was free, not under the grip of an aunt or a cousin or some assigned handler. Now, I wouldn't rent these horses now because I know better. But what I do understand is, and I feel it in my bones, what a horse represents to me now as an adult is freedom. Horses were the ticket to freedom to the American settlers of the newly acquired Western territories. Horses are married to the image of the freedom-loving American cowboys on their beloved Mustangs. And yet, the price of the cowboy's freedom is paid for by the horse. This shy vegetarian, who in the wild will flee at the first sight of the humans, we subjugate them, ride them to victory, to rule the world over, across all cultures. We do this to the horses. These animals that have delivered our goods, carried our mail, even provided food, forced to participate in empire expansion and were mercilessly butchered in the process, we ruled them as we do others across species. This marvel of creation. Why gild a lily? To make this noble beast turn tricks? It is we who should hang and bow our heads in shame. On September 15th is the presentation, Playtime. Now I am so excited that our fall series, a 5-part series, is starting next week. I know it's very soon, but I wanted to start the series because I wanted to align it with the upcoming lyric season because it's opening with Ernani. Email notification will be sent later today. You're going to get a ton of emails from me for the last 2 days. It's a 5-part series titled Opera and Inclusion. See, there's a chair waiting for you on the first row in this drawing. So it's created with a non-opera goer in mind, but it has enough quirky details for the most ardent opera fan. And the series views opera non-musically. So please come. I've had great fun putting it together. And for the first time, or actually for a change, we will have other speakers at the end of the presentation to make it a more engaging presentation. And so next week the series opens next Thursday with the perspective of war and politics, opera seen from the point of view of war and politics. Even if you don't like opera, this series is for you. Because for example, this area called, it's all the odd details that charm me that I want to share with you. Say the region that we learned about where the hamburgers came from, Tartary. Isn't it interesting to know that the opera Turandot, the protagonist, his name was Khalaf. He comes from the region of Tartary, all those areas. And Khalaf is probably, Puccini or whatever, made the name, what is called Caliph. The ruler gave him a name, Khalaf. So all these small details will come out. So even if you don't understand the music, because most of the time I don't, it's all these other viewpoints of opera that charm me. And I want to share that with you. I do hope you come. But more importantly, thank you for your time today. I'm always grateful that you make time for these because I have so much fun with this. I'm going to stop sharing now and I wish you joy.